Strap in as I jump into an impromptu discussion with Hollywood insider and producer Matt Fondiler. Unlike most episodes, there was almost no preparation, but I wanted to tackle the current events in Hollywood and Matt was amicable to that. We explored the shifting tides in movie producing, the impacts of the Screen Actors Guild strike, and the AI revolution in screenwriting. In this episode, I tried to sway Matt towards the utility of large language models as the most important innovation in his industry, which has thus far seemed slow and hesitant to adopt, and in my opinion, at its own peril. Was I persuasive enough? You decide. At any rate, please enjoy this mental roller coaster with Matt Fondiler. Hello and welcome to the RSnake Show. Today I have Matt Fondiler. How are you, sir?
I'm so good. Thanks for having me on your show.
Of course, of course. A little impromptu, so we're kind of doing this a little bit on the fly, which is great. I actually prefer this in some ways because we're going to be able to go wherever we go.
Exactly. And see, this is all new for you, but I've been planning this for a year now. I heard about the show. I was like, one day I'm going to be in this chair.
And here you are.
Indeed.
So you have quite a background in entertainment, specifically usually behind the camera. You're not one of those people who's in front of the camera typically.
Not too often. I did my fair share of acting in high school and college. Did a little bit of improv comedy after college. But when you have to start doing shows at like 12:30, 1 in the morning, and then you have to go to a desk job the next day, and there's 4 people in the audience, it's like, I'm not doing this anymore. So I've always been a writer and a producer. So that's kind of where I've been more these days.
Yeah. Okay. Well, why don't we start there? Why don't we start with your background? Like,
sure.
What got you interested in the entertainment business?
Well, I think just growing up in Los Angeles, sort of Hollywood-centric, my parents were both huge movie fans, so I just grew up loving movies. And I went to film school at Loyola Marymount. My first job out of college was as a Universal Studios tour guide. So I used to do the tram ride past Jaws and the Earthquake and the King Kong, and that was on camera. You're like, you are the guy for 100 tourists, and you're like an ambassador for the studios. So that was an incredible gig.
Okay. All right. So you got to
so
stop right there.
This.
I didn't know this. Okay. I have one story that I think summarizes everything I think about tour guides.
All right.
I was going down the Thames. There's a little tour, and I was new to the area, so I'm just kind of going down the Thames. Right. It's fun. Get on the thing. A little boat thing, and I think they go up first, so they go all the way up, and it's like a round trip. It's like $5 more, €5 more, whatever, pounds more or something to do the whole thing. So I'm like, great, whatever. They go up. It's like, oh, there's this famous place, there's this other famous place, and it's like, oh, it's pretty interesting actually. And then they turned around, and then they had to do it in reverse. It was the same tour, just in reverse. And I'm like, oh my God, this is terrible. How do I get off this thing?
That is
I was
awful.
about to jump overboard.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the Universal tour is a loop, but in the heat of summer, you've got probably twice as many trams out there than should be to accommodate all the people. And these things were built back in the 1960s. And so the heat would just destroy these trams, and they would break down constantly. And your job as a tour guide is to make it seem like it's all part of the ride. And so while you wouldn't have to repeat material, there would be instances where the tram is not moving for 35 minutes. And you have to memorize like a 4-inch ring binder of facts about every single part of the area so that you could be like, oh, and that patch of grass right there is where Jim Carrey slipped on a banana peel. And let's watch a clip of other great moments from Universal comedy films. And you have this little boop, 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 put the little button in it, and all of a sudden there's like clips of Jim Carrey playing. And you're just sitting there like waiting for this tram to move. But having a background in improv.
I was going to say, improv must have helped a lot there.
And a love of movies and the production process really helped because it was a blast to do. I had no problems with any of that.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's kind of almost a good day when something happened.
Yeah,
you know
exactly.
what I mean?
Exactly. So, all of this to say that I've always loved movies. I was trying to get a job working at a film studio. I worked as an executive assistant in a few different places, Sony Pictures, New Line Cinema. And eventually, when I was working at Sony, I had a hour-long commute from where I lived in North Hollywood to Culver City, which is where Sony Pictures was located. And every day on my commute, I would listen to a radio show hosted by Adam Carolla. Now, he's a radio personality. He was very popular in the 90s, Loveline, Dr. Drew. He hosted The Man Show with Jimmy Kimmel, and he is a huge terrestrial radio guy. He's always loved radio. And I listened to his radio show. His radio station got turned from a talk station to a must have been like a country music station or something. All the talk programs went away. And this was around 2009. And Adam said, I'm going to start doing this thing called a podcast. And even though this radio show is going to be over on Friday, apparently if you go on your computer and type in my name on Monday, you'll be able to keep listening to me. And I was part of that group of fans that listened to his podcast in the early days. And eventually that show grew.
Was that because you were getting in the comedy side of it?
A little bit. I think he was so good at drawing metaphors to things and kind of explaining things in a way that was just really interesting to me. So I just sort of enjoyed his comic sensibilities. And eventually he said, we're growing, we need help. And I literally wrote a fan letter. And I said, I live in the area. I've worked as an assistant. I could be your assistant. I mean, I don't even remember what I wrote in the letter, frankly.
Right.
And I snail mailed it. I
and
didn't
here's
even email
$100.
Yeah, exactly. And it just so happened that the woman who ran his advertising had previously worked at Sony. And I didn't know her, but she knew that Sony hires good people. And so she said, hey, I got this kid's resume. Why don't you meet him? And I ended up working for Adam for about 12 years. And I started just as I literally wrote episode descriptions for the website, and I did a little bit of scheduling. And then eventually I'm helping to produce the shows and, booking guests and really running the operations of the studio on a day-to-day basis. And that's sort of where my kind of podcasting career sort of took off. And more recently, I've expanded into the true crime realm. And
but before we get there,
sure.
I want to spend time on that one, and I want to gloss over this other stuff.
Yeah, of course.
So you said you were really into movies. Was there some particular movie or TV show that kind of sparked you? Because there's certain producers, they'll be like, there was this one thing I saw when I was a kid, and that was what opened my mind. I wanted to do this.
I think it was really just an amalgamation of movies over the years, and they're all big commercial movies. Something like Back to the Future was a huge movie for me. I loved The Right Stuff, which is about the early days of the space program, and then later watching Paul Thomas Anderson movies like Magnolia and Boogie Nights, a little bit more artistic. And then I think by the time I was going to college and getting into maybe studying film, I was like, ooh, Alfred Hitchcock, let's watch Casablanca. And I just sort of gained an overall appreciation of film history. And just along the way have always loved writing and creative writing, and felt maybe screenwriting is sort of the avenue to work in the movie biz and still be creative. So that's what I majored in, was screenwriting. And I still do a little bit of that, but these days it's been more on the producing side.
I'll tell you mine if you tell me yours.
Sure.
What is your favorite movie and why?
All right. Well, the movie that I will say is probably my favorite movie, I've seen it so many goddamn times, and it's such a film school answer, but it's a movie called City of God. And it's about basically 3 decades of crime in Rio de Janeiro. I'm not sure if you've seen it before.
I have seen it, yeah.
But it's really gritty.
It's very gritty.
On the street, gangsters, kids with guns that turn into even more dangerous teenagers with guns. And there's a little bit of a love story, but the style, the dialogue, every character has kind of a street nickname. I wouldn't say that it has elements of fantasy in it, because it's a very real movie, but there's just something about the way that it all comes together that it feels like a dream. So that's always been, first time I saw that, I was like, wow, that's what every movie could be. It's just such an incredibly well-made movie.
Yeah, I remember thinking every shot sort of felt like you were a neighbor, peering through the conversation, looking out your window, or, you're sitting in a car on the street and you're kind of watching. Every shot felt like you were not just on a set, but you were literally right next to them when it was happening. It was a very intimate, interesting, weird angles, a lot of angles above and down, like you're up on a walk-up step somewhere or something. It was very interesting shot, I thought.
Yeah, and just to have a movie that takes place over such a long period of time and to still be like really engaging, and you are meeting different characters at different phases of their lives. Like one of the plot lines, a guy he's sort of like the friend of a friend, and he's not really a big character, but then you kind of watch him fail and fail, and then by the end of the movie, he's this really dangerous person who kills one of the main characters, and you're like, holy crap, like that guy was actually one of the most important parts of this whole movie. So any movie that you can just watch over and over again and kind of continuously find something new about it, I'm all for that.
I love that answer.
What about you? What do you got?
So I'm a little embarrassed because most people, when I say it, they go, ugh, you're one of those. But it's the movie Heat.
When I walked in, I saw you got Heat 2, and I was going to ask you about that. I saw it on your bookshelf.
So
love Heat.
So Heat is very interesting because it's not what most people think it is. It's a shoot 'em up. Yeah. Of course it is. But there's two completely different things that attracted me about that movie. And there was the one that attracted me when I was a kid, or when, not kid, but college age, which is that it was such a realistic movie that actual criminals started emulating how those crime scenes happened. And that, I think, is compelling. When Hollywood predicts where crime is going to go, that is very rare and very interesting. And so I watched it a bunch of times just trying to understand how they develop these characters. And then something happened where I suddenly realized there's something weirder going on with this storyline. It's actually not really what people think it is. It's actually two completely different groups of people that are the exact same people. They even look kind of the same. They have the two Italian guys at the top, the Al Pacino and the Robert De Niro characters, and then they have the two kind of clean-cut blonde guys, and they have the two kind of fuck-up tall brunette guys, and the two Indian guys, etc. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They all kind of look approximately the same. Two black guys. They look approximately the same, but one group of people is, had they gone down the good path versus gone down the bad path. And really, the story is about the woman, Charlize Theron's character, and their child. And she has to make a decision at the end of the movie whether she gives up the kid, the Val Kilmer character, and therefore saves the kid. And they even say it like, you have an option here. You can either turn him in and your kid's going to be fine, or he's going to go to Gladiator Academy and all these bad things are going to happen to him.
Right.
And so she decides to side with Val Kilmer, and she's effectively like propagated the next generation of these criminals. And so it's really a story about what happens when you make these kind of ripple, you make this little tiny dot, and all of a sudden the repercussions throughout these children's lives just emanates and goes further and further and further. And that really made me step back and like, wow, this movie is way more complicated. And so I have rewatched it a number of times, and every time I watch it, it gets more interesting. Actually, this painting back here is actually the color code across the entire movie.
Oh, nice.
Which, it's funny enough, when my fiance gave it to me, I knew what it was the second I saw it. I'm like, wow, this is a Heat color code. I can tell just by the color pattern.
That's amazing.
Because that's how many times I've seen it.
Yeah.
But I like your answer because you're saying that it's anything you can watch over and over and find these new things about it. I've watched Heat, I don't know how many times, and each time I see one new thing, I'm like, wow, I actually didn't catch this little detail that the director just kind of threw in, this little micro thing, and it's actually kind of important to the plot. But
well, I think, movies in general have, with exceptions, I feel like it's lost the sort of artistic merit that it used to have. And that's really just within the last couple of years, where there's just...
Why is that?
I think it's because of producers wanting to make a lot of money on properties that people are already familiar with before they walk into the door. It doesn't mean that you can't take something like Barbie and make something artistic and interesting out of it, but now you need to have that. You need to have that Mattel brand behind you if you want to get your movie made. But what I was going to say is, like all pieces of great art, like a painting in a museum, you could stare at it and see something new every time. That's what a movie should be. Mm-hmm. Now, again, there are exceptions to that, but most of the run-of-the-mill movies that you're seeing, I guess it's kind of been like that for a long time, you don't necessarily need to watch it over and over again unless you just like a particular scene or an actor. You're not necessarily going to glean something new from it every time you watch it. You know, I mean, another one of my favorites is Dumb and Dumber. I love that movie. I've seen it 1,000 times, but it's basically like a Xerox machine in my mind. I can tell you every line in it. I couldn't be like, oh my God, the way that Jim Carrey is shaking his hand in that scene is amazing. You know, it doesn't really appeal to me in the same way.
But you mentioned Back to the Future.
Yeah.
That's one of those where if you watch it enough times, you might start catching new things, because when Marty runs down one of the pine trees, this place moves from pines to pine.
Yeah, it's like the twin pines to the lone pine.
Yeah, but it's those kind of little details where you're like, wow, I kind of want to rewatch that scene just to see if I can catch all the differences. The same thing, like a little puzzle, like spot all the differences between these two ducks or something. You're like, oh, I found them, you know? There's another one. So yeah, I think there is something interesting there.
For sure. But I mean, you know, I know we're going to eventually get into the topics of the SAG strike and AI, and I don't want to get too far ahead, but I do think that this new conversation that's happening around cinema is just a long way from let's just try to make something that people are going to think about.
So I think it is worth spending at least a couple of minutes talking about why Hollywood spends so much time reproducing already existing properties.
Yeah, so it's ridiculous. Like I said,
it's pretty bad.
I don't know, but I think it's just about a brand recognition. You can have a movie about an explorer adventurer, but unless his name is Indiana Jones, it's going to be really hard for people to go buy a ticket for Joe Schmo. Like they want to know, okay, this is going to be an Indiana Jones movie, or this is going to be a Mission Impossible movie. I already know what I'm going to get before I walk in there. Maybe I'll be surprised, but at least I know this is a safe bet, you know, to put my money in. But is it though?
Because then you go there and you're like, oh man.
Yeah.
Oh, I can't believe I spent 2 hours of my life in that. Like, it's horrible.
Well, I guess there's a question too of the reaction from the audience versus the expectations of the filmmakers and producers. And if the movie made a lot of money, they don't really care if you liked it or not. Like, as long as it made a lot of money, guess what? There's going to be a sequel to it, whether or not you wanted to see it or not, you know?
Yeah, I kind of feel like that's the new Star Wars episodes 1, 2, and 3 that came out much later.
Sure.
Everyone I know just universally panned it. Everyone, except for the kids.
Yep.
Kids were like, wow, this is great. And they were like, yeah, this is like a cartoon, but it's like a little bit better, like slightly higher quality than a cartoon. And the adults are like, wow, I can't possibly watch this again. It's so bad.
But it's been reclaimed by the next generation. It is strange. Yeah. I'm in the former camp. I had a real tough time watching this.
But maybe that's okay. Maybe we're not making movies for us anymore. Maybe we're making it for the kids. And then we just kind of have to step back and go, well, it's lost to time.
Yeah. I mean, my hope as a creative person is that it will one day come back around, and maybe I myself could write something that would be seen as the old school, you know, be seen as the way it used to be. I think that would be really cool.
I remember seeing, I think it was maybe Matt Damon was talking about the perils of trying to do your own stuff. He's like, you could never make Good Will Hunting today. It would be impossible. Economics just literally couldn't do it. No one would finance it. You'd never get it out the door. You'd never make your money back. But it was a smash hit at the time. So something about the industry has changed in a way that is forcing this arguably, and I think definitively, bad content to be produced in mass. Right.
But now, to draw like a parallel to the way they're making movies now, you could take a movie like Good Will Hunting, except now it's not a random person who's a janitor who's actually brilliant. They'll just find a name or somebody that you've heard of, and they find a way to like, oh, this is their story. And now you're like, oh, well, now we can go learn the story of, you know, this name that I'm familiar with, as opposed to investing time in a new character, you know? So,
and anyway, he's wrong. They'll just make Good Will Hunting too.
Yeah. And then there's that too. Exactly. I know it's so bizarre.
Yeah.
But I guess that's just the way that it goes. You know, it used to be $5 to go see a movie. Now it's $25 to go see it in an IMAX. So everything's just, it all costs more. It costs more to make. It costs more to see it. I don't know if that's really better for anybody.
Right. Well, we'll get to cost in a second. I think that fits into the SAG questions. But Is anything excites you about the movie industry now? That's like things that we're seeing that's happening. That's maybe not quite here yet, but we're starting to see it happen.
I mean, the part that I find exciting is really as a consumer. I don't think anybody who's running a film industry business would like my answer, but I loved post-pandemic where all those movies were coming on our at-home streaming services within like a week or two of coming out. That was just
they hate that.
They hate it, but it was so great as a consumer of products to, you know, not have to go spend $100 to go see a movie that my wife and I want to watch. Like I can honestly watch it for free like the following week. And again, nobody wants to hear that, but nobody wanted to hear about Napster and getting music for free. And guess what? Now you can, as long as you're paying your $9.99 for Spotify, you have access to every song you want to as much as you want to.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's something like that for movies. They're trying to do that with, you know, like a theater pass. You know, you pay $25 and you can see 3 movies a month or something like that. I suppose that's a move in the right direction. But I don't know. I want movies to be important again. And I just feel like the more TV is taken over, the more video games have taken over, movies just don't have what they had. So I guess it's a way of saying I'm not super excited about it, the future of it, especially given all these strikes and everything. It's putting everything on even further hold. You know, I'll be the first in line for the next Mission Impossible movie, but like, I don't know, I'm waiting to see.
I think there's some interesting tech out there that could change the industry a little bit. For instance, as an example, I think there's more than this, but once we get to the point where you can do individual eye tracking and individual stylized 3-dimensional data. So there are cameras out there that will shoot at infinite depth, and then you can artificially blur at any depth. So you can blur everywhere except where your eye is focused. So if my eye is focused on the building, it should have the building in focus and everything else should disappear, you know, be blurred in front and back. But right now you can't do that. Right now, everything's the focal length that the director decided you're going to be looking at, which is a very I actually do not like watching things in 3D because my eyes naturally want to look at things in the background and I'm not allowed to. It's like, it kind of gives me a bit of a headache. I'm like, what is wrong with my eyes? They're not focusing the way they need to, you know, for a split second. And then I realize what's happening. I'm like, that's kind of annoying because I kind of want to see that little detail in the background, which I'm not allowed to look at. But if it's shot with infinite depth, my eyes can tell by, you know, where they're focused, can tell the camera that's focused on my eye. It's got a little weird thing that's happening there, that I want to look at that thing in the distance and give me that focal length and show me that thing.
So that's interesting because now what we're talking about is every person gets a unique viewing experience of the same content. So it's not like we can both see this same scene from Ghostbusters and both notice this exact same thing, and this is what everybody notices about the movie, but you could watch this scene and be looking at one thing. I could be watching the same scene and get something completely different out of it because I haven't been looking at that part of it.
That's right.
That's wild. But I wonder too if like a director or somebody with like a really strong creative vision would allow that to happen because they want to control where your eye is.
Of course, but I think that works in a 2D universe, and maybe this is just because I haven't watched enough 3D because of this problem. I get a little bit of a, I don't know, not a headache exactly, but I'm like, it's not doing what my eyes want it to do. My will is stronger than the movie, and it ends up being complicated for me to watch the movie. I end up spending more time thinking about how it was shot than the action itself. You know what I mean?
Yep.
It's like, why did you decide to not let me look at this thing? You know, like it's kind of interesting. It's an explosion going off the background. Yeah, but they're supposed to be looking at this person's face and they're crying or whatever in the foreground. I'm like, I don't care. There's an explosion. It's kind of, you know what I mean? Like you've chosen to make me look at this thing, but actually it's not natural.
Yeah. And at that point, they've lost you.
They've lost me, right? I certainly don't care about them crying now. You know, if I ever did in the first place. I think that if you have this amalgam, it makes it easy to rewatch it. You're like, ooh, I missed that detail. I kind of need to rewatch it to catch that thing you saw. Like, oh, you didn't see the thing in the mirror? I'm like, what thing in the mirror? And, you know, and it's now you're like rewinding it and watching it. And director's cuts mean things like, well, if you look at it in this focal length or look at this part of it or whatever, and like it'll blur this part. You can actually do new, interesting things you wouldn't normally be able to do with that technology.
Right. Well, I mean, film has always been an expression of latest technology. So it's not unusual to think that as new technology emerges, it's going to find its way into the film industry, because that's just kind of how it's always worked. So, but it is interesting to do something like you're talking about, where you're actually like subjectively changing the way two different people will view the same thing. And that's really interesting to me.
So you could do it with a two-dimensional laptop, let's say, as long as you had a camera pointing at your eyes and your eyes could see approximately where you're looking, and you had knowledge of what all the depth layers look like. So let's say you created a three-dimensional object. It wouldn't work as well for something that's shot, and I'll tell why in a second. But let's say it's a three-dimensional object and it's spinning around or something, and I want to look at the background. It just sees that I'm looking at the background. It says, okay, blur the foreground. Now the background's sharp. The reason why an actual real-world scenario doesn't work as well is because your eyes are offset ever so slightly. And so the cameras do not exist that are perfectly spherical, that have the iris at the right width apart that your eyes are, or average eyes are, or whatever, that can capture all the different angles at all of those resolutions. So it needs to be infinite depth and also perfectly ball-shaped to catch an entire room, let's say. So that technology, I think Facebook was working on it, and then they abandoned it for some reason. They had a special code. They were going to productize this thing. It was going to be this ball that you could put on your desktop, and then you could sort of be in the room. You know, once this ball's in the room, you can look at it, everything in all dimensions. You just can't move up or down or side to side or whatever. You're stuck in this space, but you can rotate and look up and down.
They kind of do that already with like mouse technology I've seen before, where you get like essentially like a bunch of cameras in the middle of a room, and you can kind of, using your mouse or your finger, you can kind of spin the camera around. You could see around the whole room, like a 360 kind of thing. Similar,
except only technically one camera. It's probably an amalgam of many sub cameras. But you get my drift. It's one ball, and it needs to be a ball that's shaped exactly the width of your eyes. So that's the other weird caveat. But the cool part is you can put this like in a coffee shop in Paris or whatever and be transported there.
Right.
And now you're in there, and you can have infinite, and so your eyes will work the same way your eyes would work. Like I could be looking at that person crossing the street, or looking at that car, or looking at the pastry or the baguette or the waitress or whatever.
And it'll know to kind of blur to focus wherever your eye is.
Because it has a camera on your eyes. So I think that kind of technology can fundamentally change how people consume information. Because if I can be watching a movie, but I can do it from a laptop sitting in a ski resort, you know, in Aspen or something, compared to my couch, you know, I have a nice couch. It's not like it's a bad couch, but it's certainly not a couch in Aspen.
Yeah.
It might be something I'd be willing to wear whatever it takes to get on my head, including some crazy Apple device that can do this like complex like analysis of where my eyes are looking and depth of field.
That's just so wild. And eventually that's going to work its way into like television and just like a home system, like you're saying, like this theoretically is something that everybody gets one day.
Yeah, I don't know if it'll ever reach that level, because the problem is you and I are both going to be looking at different places on a television set. So that may be hard, but you never know. Maybe they have ways to show you something versus showing me things.
Right, right.
You know, so maybe there's a way to polarize it or something. I don't know. But I do know that for personal computing, it seems like that's where things are going to end up going. They're not there yet, obviously, but it feels like that's the natural path. I can see it already kind of going down that path. It's like when you first got a cell phone or a PDA or something back when you were, I don't know how old you were when those things came out, but for me, I'm like, yep, they're going to have a GPS on these things. They're going to have Wi-Fi. They're going to have Bluetooth so I can connect to other devices to it. Like I could tell you everything that was going to be in that thing in 10 years. And sure enough, then they came out with the iPhone. I'm like, yeah, see, that's what I was talking about.
Should have been you, man.
That should have been me.
Let him get the R phone.
But, you know, you just look at something, you're like, I can tell where it's supposed to go.
Sure.
You know what I mean? I know where it is. Yeah, that's interesting. I'll use it as is because that's all I've got, but I can tell where it's supposed to go.
Yeah.
So that feels like the big innovation for me. I don't know. I don't know about storytelling either, but I feel like ChatGPT is coming fast.
Sure does. I never heard those three letters GPT in the same sentence. And now since, I don't know, maybe the beginning of the year, maybe it's a little bit before then. It's everywhere.
That's the word.
That's
ChatGPT.
it. Now I was telling you off mic, I'm very familiar with it only because it's something that everybody's talking about I have not used it. I'm kind of afraid to do it, but talking to you about it made me feel a little bit more comfortable about it.
Okay. Well, let me convince you here and now that you have to use it. It's
Please.
just a matter of time. So let's say you were going to write a script, right? And let's say the best creativity you could possibly produce is like 10 pages a day or something, right? Of good quality content, not just pumping out garbage. Well, ChatGPT can pump out 10 pages of content, which may or may not be good. It may not be good. It might be terrible, as a matter of fact. But it also might be okay, or maybe even very good, or maybe even way better than you could have done. And it can do it in a few seconds. And so then you go back and you're like, you know what? This is wrong. This is wrong. And instead of editing it by hands, you can just tell it, hey, this is wrong and this is wrong. It's like, oh, sorry. It'll redo it. And all of a sudden you have gone from, let's say, a days of really painstaking, best you can possibly produce. Like you're dead tired at the end of the day, sweating to get this masterpiece out the door, to a few minutes of barely thinking about it and it's done.
Right. But as a counter to it, part of the life of being an artist is that torture. It is coming up with the exact way to express a thought. And while I could see something like ChatGPT helping me spawn a new idea that maybe I didn't think of,
sure,
I don't know if like ethically or morally, I would feel comfortable copy pasting and saying, this is my brain that came up with this.
So let's say you have competition in the world and they have, I don't know, even vaguely less ethics than you do. And they're like, I can produce an entire script in a hot afternoon. Maybe it's not good. It probably isn't good, but
they'll make sequels.
But it is close enough that I can go through and say what's wrong with it, get it to fix those things, maybe one or two more revisions. Then I get someone to read it. They're like, wow, this is pretty good, but I would change this or that, or whatever. Okay, please change this or that. And now you have a full-blown, 120-minute long script or whatever that has been produced, not written by, but produced by a person.
Right.
In literally hours of work, maybe.
It's very intriguing, and I could see why a studio is saying this is the future of storytelling. Because what do we need? What do we need people for when I can come up with an idea and type it in and tell the computer, make it better until I like the way it looks. So what do I need to pay Matt Fondiler to like come up with something?
Worse yet, it can take in you just have to provide the right prompts. So, excuse me, let's say you said, my target demographic is this. Here's the type of toys that I'm going to have to sell after the series is over to make my money back. We need to make sure the production costs are approximately this. So you need to calculate the approximate costs associated with each of these scenes. Then you need to create the schedule for who's going to be there and when. You could do all of that in literally minutes.
Wow. And you told me too that you can be like, but give me those answers as if you were Steven Spielberg. And then the machine will be able to tell you, well, when I was filming Jaws, I had to spend this. Oh my God.
Yes.
This is bizarre.
Yes.
This is weird.
Yes.
What do you need a podcast guest for? just type in a prompt and just fucking have someone read it.
We're getting there.
Yeah.
I was talking with a buddy of mine. One of the episodes, I'm not ever going to tell which one, but only one, I used ChatGPT to ask some questions. I'm like,
really?
Okay, yeah. So,
that's great.
But I only did it once. But I said, okay, here's the subject matter. Come up with 5 compelling questions to ask a guest of this kind of, skill level or whatever, what they're good at. And it came up with 5 questions, and most of them were kind of garbage, but one of them was an incredibly good question. I'm like, oof, I'm glad I asked it because I would have missed that detail.
Yeah.
And it sent us down an interesting conversation, but I think it could get way better. It's just that I wasn't good at prompting it. Had I said, okay, here's the questions I'm already asking. I want to fit it into this theme, or I want to expand on, these types of themes, or I want it to have this kind of voice, or I want it to be more punchy or whatever. And in script writing, generating net new content, it's amazing. Like I've had it like generate rap battles for me and buddies, just out of the blue. And it doesn't know anything about my friend, but I just tell it approximately what they're good at or whatever. And
you guys do a lot of rap battling?
Yeah, apparently. Now we're going to. Not good at it. That's why I need ChatGPT.
Yeah.
But you get my drift. Like it's insanely good at producing something that me, Robert Hansen, would be terrible at. So let's say the scene was a rap battle. I don't need to write a rap battle from scratch. Like, I can have ChatGPT do that. And yeah, it's going to be a little rough around the edges. And yeah, it's not going to be hardcore enough. And okay, well, I say write it like as if you're Eminem. And, you know,
yep, exactly.
You know, and then now it's, you know, tougher. And
well, see, that's the part of the technology that I like. I like the idea of using it as a reference tool, essentially. Like previous to ChatGPT, like if I wanted to tell a story that took place in a certain time that I wasn't familiar with, I have to go do a little bit of research. I got to read books about that time period. I got to look at Wikipedia. So I'm already using a little bit of technology to kind of help my brain understand the history of something. So I like the idea that instead of spending all the time doing that, I could just type in what was life like in Venice in 1300 and just get that information delivered to me by a computer. I'm fine with that. You know, you're playing Words with Friends. There's websites that can kind of, you type in the letters that you have and they'll tell you all the available words that are available. It's cheating a little bit, but I'm just saying you can use technology to kind of help your game. But when you are cutting yourself out of it intentionally, when I'm like, I'm no longer going to be the one telling this love story. I'm just going to say, tell me a love story. That's the part where I start to go like, at least for me, just as a writer.
But you could still be your love story.
Right. Like and I could still use it to help me think of ideas for a love story, but I want to still be the one to tell that story eventually.
You can be. So what you can do is say, all right, here's the love story. Here's what I want to happen. I want to be set here with these characters, these age groups, these age range, blah, 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 blah. But I also want this to be the protagonist have these characteristics, and I want this and this because I want this outcome. And you can get really detailed. Like your prompts could be pages and pages long. Wow. And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, and it'll do the longer and more complicated you get, one of two things will happen. It'll forget what you're talking about and do something random. It'll totally hallucinate. If you give it too many parameters and make it too specific, it will go off the rails.
Just like, fuck you, I'll do what I want.
Yeah, well, specifically if you're trying to get it to say, like, tell me a time where there's a legal doctrine that said that cups were illegal. So there's no such time that happened. So it's like, okay, cups are illegal. So, and it'll just make stuff up, you know?
Okay,
it's
so
like,
lies.
Yeah, it hallucinates. It doesn't know the answer, and it's forced to give an answer instead of just saying, I can't find anything that meets that criteria. It doesn't push back.
Now, does ChatGPT as like an entity, does it forever now think that there was a time period where cups were outlawed? Now that somebody in the world has said, tell me about when cups were outlawed, does it now believe that?
That is a possibility, depending on what they choose to do with the data. We don't think so. We don't think they're leveraging it to train other things. And thankfully, because people put in a lot of garbage. I put in a lot of garbage.
Right.
To see what it does.
I just think a lot of people are really fucked up. And when the first thing you're going to do when you get that system is you're going to type in, you want your phone to cuss at you. You know, you want to try to like poke the bear a little bit. So I can only imagine what garbage people are putting in.
I've got it to do all kinds of things it's designed not to do.
Yeah.
So that's the adversarial model. But I think that there is, but on the good side, let's talk about the good, because I think that's where people are hesitant. I've run into, I would say half the people I talk to love it or theoretically love it. They just haven't done it yet. And the other half are terrified of it and want to stay as far away from it as possible, kind of for some of the reasons you do, because they want to have full autonomy over their ideas. They want it to be their ideas, and they want to hang their hat on that detail.
It's an ego thing. There shouldn't be a reason for that, but for some reason it feels better that way.
I can argue against why that's a good idea for multiple reasons. A, it makes you slower. It makes you not competitive. It might be worse. And also, frankly, your ideas came from somewhere. It didn't come from nowhere. I'm sorry. I don't care how creative you think you were. It came from somewhere. You borrowed this idea from somebody somewhere.
You're absolutely right.
So you're always borrowing ideas from somewhere. But I think this speeds up the process, especially for things that are more like learning how to program. I don't know how to program. And I don't know the nuances of a programming languages I've never touched before, let's say. I do know how to program, but you know what I mean? So I'm learning how to program for the very first time, and hey, how do I do this? Oh, here, this is where you got this wrong. It's like, I get in this error message. Well, here's why. It's like, oh. It's like all the benefits of having a really good teacher without having to have paid for a teacher. It's just at your fingertips. I've found probably hundreds of reasons why this has made my life easier. I I still have to double check its work. It's not like it's not truly for free. You still have to work. But I'd rather have the bulk of the typing done that's spelled correctly, grammatically correct, approximately. And as you said about the time period, that was a good example, a really good example. Somebody was talking about, like, what's the right way to fix a toilet? Like, give me a universal way to fix toilets or whatever. And one of the instructions, if memory serves, I can't quite remember how this happened, but it was basically like, remember to extinguish the flames first. And people were like,
oh, one of those fire toilets.
But apparently there is a type of toilet that is not used in the United States at all, but in certain African regions that they use flames to operate a pump or something. And so, yes, you first want to extinguish the flame before you start operating anything with a toilet, let it cool down. And I'm getting that detail possibly slightly wrong, but you get my drift.
Yeah,
It was something you and I would have never guessed. You're like, actually, I'm glad I asked the question the way I asked it, because I got an answer I wouldn't have expected, because it has a far larger corpus of information than you and I have at our fingertips.
Yeah. Well, and on that note, I will say something I am curious to do is to take, one or two of the, movie concepts that I have in my head that have never really made it past the concept stage. You're trying to, you write books, like you try to flesh out an idea and have some structure to it. So there are a few things that I've had ruminating in my mind for years and years. I've never been able to really get it to click. And so I would be interested to kind of type in what I do have and see if the Chat GPT can kind of put those puzzle pieces together for me. And then at that point, I would probably go back on my own and fill in the blanks as needed.
Totally.
But in that regard, I do think it could be a useful technology. But
I was kind of helping some people learn it the other day, and they had no idea. I'd never touched it. I think I told you a little bit about this off camera.
It's fascinating. Please.
Yeah. But one of the things that I was showing them is like, well, they own a studio, so they're like, okay, we want to make a contract for people investing in the studio, let's say. I'm like, okay, well, see here, like, write me a contract for, and I told them, literally a sentence or so, and it produced a contract. I'm like, look, it's a terrible contract. It's broken in probably 100 different ways. So the next question is, tell me all the ways this contract is broken. It's like, okay, well, here's like 20 different ways this contract is horrible. I'm like, great. Now fix that contract using all this stuff. And now it produced a pretty good contract.
Now it's airtight.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. But it's certainly wildly better than the first draft, and way better than they would have done by hand. And so now you can hand that to your lawyer and say, hey, can you spice this up and make sure that there's no things that are to be worried about, whatever. And now your lawyer is handing that off to their assistant, who's handing it off to ChatGPT to find a couple of issues, and you're making it ever so slightly better, and you've saved yourself an insane amount of time.
Right.
And money.
It definitely has some very practical purposes. I don't want to just be here shitting on it because I don't know enough about it, but I like hearing about the ways that it can help us.
Sure.
Because all the headlines that you read about, especially these days, is how it's going to destroy all of us. Mm-hmm. So it's good to have a positive voice on the topic for once.
But if you embrace it, I'm not saying if everyone embraces it. If you embrace it, you're ahead of your competition.
Right.
Now you have a leg up. Now you can build the thing that they can't build, and you can do it faster. You can turn your day into 10, 20 days. You can produce content at a quality and at a speed that is unparalleled to your competition, unless they do this.
What's to stop somebody from essentially plagiarizing a Chat GPT script?
Nothing.
And so that's...
I mean, possibly some legal issues, but other than that, nothing.
But theoretically, nothing. See, that's got to change, right?
Does it?
Does it?
Does it?
Doesn't it?
I don't know. I don't know.
I guess we just, like you said, we have to stop thinking about our society in these traditional ways that it used to be, because it's just not going to be like that anymore. So you're absolutely right.
And you can push back all you want, but indie films will just go right through you. They'll just mow you down, you're standing still, because they can produce it faster, better quality.
And it gets better too, right? The technology just continuously gets better. A year from now, it's going to be 20 years from now.
The video that they're able to produce now, I wish I'd written down the name, but it's called like Redress or something. I wish I knew the name, but they are able to produce content that is between like 2 and 3 second snapshot videos. So you give it like a movie, or you give it an image, and it can produce video. And it's not great, but but it is interesting looking. And in fact, so interesting looking that you kind of can't stop looking at it when you're looking at it. Like, wow, that is really weird what's going on. It's kind of almost psychedelic.
Yes, I've seen it was like an AI generated fast food commercial, and everybody's like faces are melting and they're like eating their hands instead of French fries. But you're just like, this is crazy.
It's
this
like
is amazing. Yeah.
So we're not good yet. This is not good technology yet, but you can tell exactly where it's going to go. And it doesn't take too much experimentation to get it over that line, to get that next level. And so if that's the case, a guy like me who has a passing interest in producing a movie, let's say, I go, hey, I got this script idea, feed it into ChatGPT, it flushes it out for me after a couple iterations. Maybe I get a copy editor to double check my work and make sure there's nothing super weird about it, fix it that one time, and then I feed that into this generator, probably Mid-Journey to create the stills, and then I feed that into this other system that creates the movie, stitch it all together. It cost me $20,000 to make the whole movie, literally all of, and that's
from creative conception to final product,
everything. 20 grand. I'm not kidding. And then all of a sudden you have something that is very interesting to watch, and it well written, and has a thorough plot. So it's actually compelling to watch from a plot perspective. And maybe it's even targeted to my demographic because that's who I targeted it to. You know what I mean? It's a Robert Hansen specific movie that Robert Hansen will love, and maybe some other people love it too, but it doesn't matter because he'll love it, and I want him to love it.
Right.
You know what I mean? You could do that. I think you could do that soon, like the next handful of years. So if Hollywood doesn't embrace it, wow, are they falling behind fast?
Right. Well, that's the current issue that's going on right now, right?
So let's talk about it.
Transition. Because, you got all the producers saying, what do we need to give all these actors all this money, deal with all these unions? Like, we're just going to do it ourselves in-house here.
So let's talk about residuals first, and then we'll get back to the AI thing. Because I think that the residuals, I think, is the big one. I think we're all talking about AI as if it's the big sticking point. But first of all, can you kind of describe what's going on just for the people who are not paying attention to Hollywood?
Well, and I don't necessarily have my finger on the pulse either, but my understanding of it is a group of a union of writers, and then more recently, the union of actors basically decided that for lack of a better phrase, the Netflix model has destroyed the entertainment industry. You used to have a TV show that had commercials, and it was on once a week, and you had to tune in at this time, and you knew that you were going to watch X amount of sponsors between each of your segments. And when this episode airs again in syndication, everybody who is a part of it is all going to get a paycheck for their little part of the project. But now we live in a world where there's no commercials. It's all on the Netflix platform. And there's no such thing as syndication. Something that's on Netflix is just going to be on Netflix in perpetuity. So the supply and the demand gets all thrown off. And so now you've got actors who were used to getting paid for when a movie they did 30 years ago shows up on TBS. They're not getting that check anymore. And from a writer's perspective, what they would do a lot is they'll have what they call like a writer's room, and they get a bunch of people before production even starts, and they generate all the concepts for the show, what it's going to be, who the characters are going to be. But this show isn't going to really go into production until like a year from now. And so all of those people who were in those writers' rooms, they may not be available a year from now. So you get people who put all their creative thought into, let's say, a television show, and then by the time they're making that television show, that person who came up with the idea is no longer a part of the project. And so writers and actors are all getting kind of pissed off about how this industry is sort of pushing them out when you need actors to promote your movie. You need them to emote the lines of dialogue. You need the writers to write the lines of dialogue, or so we thought. But now with something like AI, we're learning you don't need writers to write those thoughts. You don't need actors to emote those thoughts. So that's, I think, is where it's all kind of butting heads.
Okay, let's get that in a second.
That makes sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
It does. So there's a bar, I think in Studio City, named Residuals. And if you go to that bar and you show them a paycheck that is less than $1, they'll give you a free drink. Because that is a super common occurrence where people are getting these micro checks for thousands or maybe even millions of views of whatever thing that they acted in or wrote or whatever. And part of that is Hollywood wants to say, we deserve more. We put our blood, sweat, and tears into making these shows. The studios, obviously, they deserve a good chunk because they're spending all the marketing budget, et cetera, and they're taking a lot of the risk. Maybe even all of the risk, really, if you think about it, because at least somebody gets some amount of payment for showing up to do the job, right? So you just don't get upside, but they can actually lose money. But theoretically, the idea would be some of that upside should go to, some more than fractions of a dollar should go to the writers and the people who worked behind the scenes. And I think I don't have a problem with that, with the exception of the fact what that ends up doing is creating an artificial floor. And what tends to happen is that directors find ways to cut those people out rather than pay them. It's just like, well, we'll just have less of them. And so it doesn't actually end up working out the way people think it will. Yes, the people who do get paid more, but a lot of people get paid nothing.
Right.
So it ends up not working out in their benefit. Typically, that's typically how these things work. But the secondary question about what the best example I saw was some guy was he's an actor, and he showed up and he did some extra work on something. I forget what the details were, and he got a phone call from a friend of his, and he's like, "Hey, my son just shot you." He's like, "What?" He's like, "He just shot you in some video game." He was like, "What?" And so he got the hold of this video game or got a photo of it or whatever, and his likeness was used in a video game that he had nothing to do with and knew nothing about.
Wow.
But he had signed some agreement that said that he gets to get some small payment for a permanent, perpetual, forever license for in perpetuity for his likeness in all ways and whatever, everywhere in the universe, including in these video games, which he had nothing to do with at all and didn't know even existed. And so his complaint was, I feel like I should get paid for that. I feel like I didn't agree to that. I agreed to something, which was a digitization of my face. So you, in case I die or something, you can put me in, sort of like those old Coke commercials, or they brought in like these, people who were dead like 20 years or whatever.
Sure. Yeah, the cable commercials and stuff do that too.
Yeah. JFK was suddenly dancing around on stage with, whatever. But things are different now. I can digitize your face, pay you a couple dollars for the day's job, and now I have this thing, this avatar of you forever, and I never have to pay you again, and you don't age. And I'm a very mixed mind about this, because on one part I totally understand. I get why people would go, "Wow, that's so messed up." I didn't know that was what was going to happen. And some of that's just like, well, you got to read your contracts better, and some of it is, well, that bad things are going to happen when you work in these organizations that definitely don't care about you. They're just care about profit.
Well, it's a cliche for a reason. You sell your soul, and now you have literally sold your like physical manifestation. It's kind of the same thing. You are, like you said, like you have to know what you're getting into. But
the problem is, people are very upset about this, and to some extent, I think it's a right. They have a right to be upset for sure. But I think it's misunderstanding where things are going, because where it's going is, I don't need your avatar. I don't need you at all. There's already software out there being produced where you can create virtual crowds. So I don't really need 20 extras walking around. I just, program in, I'm looking for, a woman of this height and a man of this height and, 2 children and a baby carriage and whatever, right? It's just sort of milling around the background, going from here to here, whatever. I don't need actors anymore at all for that background. It's all blurred out anyway. You can't even see their faces. It's just background noise. So why am I paying residuals for somebody I can't even see on camera anyway? And so the directors are going to be looking at this from a cost-benefit analysis. Number one, they'll be thinking, wow, I can reduce my costs by getting rid of the actors. But then there's this other subsequent problem that I think is really dangerous for Hollywood to ignore, for actors in particular to ignore, which is that actors are fuck-ups. They are. Producers are fuck-ups. Writers are fuck-ups. Every human being on Earth is basically a fuck-up, really, unless they're very young or something. They all have things in their past that are, probably get them canceled for something they said at one party they shouldn't have said one time, right? And all it takes is a handful of, your favorite actor in a franchise that's going for 5 seasons, or this is the phase 2 of the Marvel whatever, and all of a sudden it turns out that they're a pedophile, and you're like, wow, we're gonna have to, we can't use their likeness anymore. I don't care if we have their likeness, we just can't use it at all. We've got to kill this character off immediately, and then you lose all the value of all the stuff you built up. So what happens is they say actors are out. We just got to get rid of them. We can't have the albatross of whatever random messed up thing they did to get here, or whatever random thing they're going to do because they're here, because they have all this money and clout or whatever. And now we're just like, it's all digital avatars, 100%. None of it's real.
I mean, when we get to the point where it can actually look as real as anything else, maybe we'll all be okay with it. But until then,
I feel like we are a few years away. I'm not saying this is happening tomorrow.
Yeah.
But I don't think we're 20 years away. And so if we are, let's split the difference, say 10 years away. If we are 10 years away and we're fighting over onesie-twosie residuals now, and we're basically telling the directors, you got to hurry up. You got to hasten all research to get rid of these people at a faster pace. They will do what they can to reduce that time horizon.
Right.
So you're really just shooting yourself in the foot, because right now, at least you've got a job. But I don't think you're going to have a job. Not you necessarily.
Yeah. No, I get it. Yeah, I mean, I think what's going to happen, and like you're saying, is just everyone has to kind of learn how to live with this technology. And you're right. Maybe we will come to a point where a film experience is strictly digital. But that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be a bunch of people in New York who are going to want to go see some live theater. So maybe if you're an actor, maybe you stop acting in movies and maybe you just start acting in live performances. And maybe we start to see an uptick in the Shakespeare in the parks of the world. And it's like, okay, well, you can go support the film industry, or you could support the human industry. Mm-hmm. I don't know. That's just something I'm just trying to.
I don't think so. I don't think it's going to work.
We're done.
I think we're done. I think the writing's on the wall. I mean, I think there will always be individual actors and actresses and people who like to perform. I think that's just human nature. I think that's part of growing up, is learning how to play different roles, just to learn how they fit in your brain. You're like, oh, this is the bad guy in my brain. This is the good guy in my brain. This is the boring person in my brain. This is the exciting person in my brain. So you have to learn how to act just to grow up, and to some degree, right? As long as you're not very Asperger-y, where you don't necessarily have those emotional divisions in your brain, let's say. But being a normal, and bunny ears there, person, that's just what you do. You act. You act out things, and you act out things with your significant other, your friends. I'm acting out the bad guy, and they laugh. They think it's funny, like, oh, you're playing the bad guy, and it's part of it, right?
Right.
So that will never go away.
But you won't be able to make money doing it anymore.
I just don't think there's money there anymore.
What about like being a chef? Cooking is another art that, yes, we can get robots in to do all the cooking, and yes, they know to put the exact amount of pepper on the filet before you flip it, and it knows the exact temperature to flip the steak. But cooking is also like, and eating is also like it can be a visceral, artistic, you think of how this was plated, and there is a creativity to it. Is that also, that's just done? You can't be a chef anymore?
And get paid for it?
Right.
Oof, I don't know about paid. Maybe a little bit. Maybe there's some creativity left that's on the fringes, and probably the same thing with all sort of artistic horizons. There might be some fringe where there is some money to be made, but it's this like fraction of a percent kind of people, which is already the case of Hollywood, but I think it's going to be exacerbated.
I'm starting to lean into my writing chair a little bit, though, because from what I could tell, that ChatGPT still needs a person to write in the words. We haven't gotten into that point yet where the ChatGPT is chatting itself.
Oh, that's coming too.
Yeah. I'm like, okay, well then fuck it.
Yeah,
just give me a gun,
No, we're getting there. We're getting there. It's not there yet, and so there is time. But, and I think you'd be smart to be on the
the
frontier of it.
Yeah. I'm going to start typing into ChatGPT. You've convinced me.
Yeah. See,
this is how I have to be a writer, is to write into ChatGPT. It's done.
But being a prompt engineer is what we're really talking about.
Right. Prompt engineer. What a title.
I know.
I'm
sorry.
a chief prompt engineer.
I'm sorry. It's a thing. It's a real thing. People are hiring for prompt engineers now.
William Shakespeare's rolling over in his grave right now.
Yeah, he is. Or not. He liked the absurdist. I mean, that's something I read the other day. It's like all these Shakespearean derivatives, they never captured how campy Shakespeare actually wanted his plays to be. Like funny, not serious, like droning on, but funny and weird and campy. But I think that if you take this to its logical extremes, you're going to have to get on board with this. You have to do it if you want to stay in the business. But your business will change.
Right.
And so what you're really replacing is people who aren't willing to change. The people who only want to be on stage and be loved by a huge audience, I think that's going away, or very quickly diminishing. We're still going to have A-list actors for a while. I'm not saying that's happening today.
Yeah, but like you said, 20 years from now, that's pretty quick, really.
Yeah.
I mean, that still feels like that's my lifetime still.
Because if I could create an avatar that looks and acts real and had an incredibly interesting plot line and all this cool stuff, and I could tailor it to the audience. So this audience gets this one, this audience gets this one, like this is the Indian looking version of the same avatar and whatever, and it's all fake. And there's no controversy ever. There's never a time when they said the wrong thing to the wrong person, or, turn their nose up at some charity or whatever thing that got them blacklisted. There's nothing. There's nothing to go after them for. There's no likeness of anybody. It's an amalgam of maybe thousands of people's faces or likenesses, not even faces exactly.
Isn't a chat GPT sentient thing that's walking around 20, 30 years from now? Can't that thing say something wrong and get deleted? Or is this just going to be a purely utopic, if that's a word, like a utopia where...
No, I think there's always going to be an editor between the output of a ChatGPT and the input of a TV screen.
Right.
You're still going to want human beings to double check and make sure there's no cultural references that might be missing. Or
right, that's kind of what I was getting at.
Yeah, so think of it, I think you'll have prompt engineers and editors. Prompt engineers will produce this massive amount of data and maybe do first passes or whatever, and then you'll still want an editor to go, the content is good, but it would be so much better if this happened before that happened. And we also want to do these 20 things over here, and hooking that into the pipeline of actually making money in Hollywood, which is, sales of product, right? That's where they make the bulk of their money anyway. So if we're selling like these dolls or whatever, we got to have a doll, and it's got to be more part of the thing. And you got to add in the doll here, here, and here kind of thing. And that's where the editor gets in there and like tailors it. Like you got a Heinz bottle of ketchup. It's got to be Heinz, and it's got to be here. And he's got to say something about Heinz here. We've got them. So you go back and you say, prompt engineer, fix this, this, this. No writers anymore, but they're kind of writing, they're like, changing some words here and there, but
I'm putting a line on my resume when I get home. Senior prompt engineer. I'm getting, since 2023, I'm starting it now. 3 years from now, we've got 8 years of prompt engineering experience. I'm golden, baby.
You will.
Yeah.
I mean, I firmly believe that's true. And now, how many people are going to be following in your footsteps and hounding you to be, better than you? Right? So being good at it is going to be tricky because it's evolving. It's moving quickly.
Nobody can engineer prompts the way I can. Come on, you don't know me.
Yeah. I mean, so that's why I think Hollywood is being, the Screen Actors Guild in particular is being a little silly. I think that they have a good point, but I think that they're going to have a short-term win for a long-term loss.
So do you think that they will get a short-term win? Like production's going to start back up again by the end of the summer? Yeah. But and long run, it ain't going to be something you...
Yeah, all the executives are, going overseas and spending time with their kids and stuff. They don't care what happens when they're gone anyway. Right, so
that's true.
End of the summer, people come back. Yeah, it's time to get back to work. Fine, end the thing. We got to get back doing some stuff. And also... there's a lot of people who aren't affected, a lot of reality TV shows that are kind of outside the Screen Actors Guild.
Absolutely.
So those people will continue to produce and have a lot more garbage on TV. And
yeah. Well, and that's the thing too. Like we have so much content that's created by humans and it's junk. It's so bad. So, you know, maybe all this love of all this content being generated by humans and we all share this human experience and that's where we need to draw all these stories from. Maybe that's outdated thinking. And maybe there is a lot of crap that's being put out just because we're so focused on this human experience. And maybe an artificial intelligence can create things and tell stories in a way that will shift the way that we perceive things. Maybe we won't all feel like, well, that thing's not a human, so how could it understand things the way that I do? And I watched a lot of Battlestar Galactica when that show came back. Did you watch that at all? The reboot?
Yeah.
The Cylons?
Yeah.
Humans, Cylons, who's who, where we all came from?
Yeah.
Loved it.
Yeah. Not the last season. Last season lost me a little bit.
Sure. got a little crazy by the end. But still, the idea of
everything up to then I loved. I thought it was really well done.
Yeah, and just the whole, I mean, the catchphrase of that show was everything's happened before and all this will happen again. Like just the sort of cyclical nature of man and machine and how we can live together or not live together. And it really doesn't matter what you do. It's inevitable.
Yeah, I like to think of it. I was telling you about this a little bit earlier. Something that ChatGPT and I came up with collectively, actually, was the idea that the world is an amalgam of technology and human beings and other things, obviously. But specifically those two, we are becoming a very large cyborg, a singular, very large, interconnected cyborg. And we think of us not as an individual, but as cells in the collective organism. And if you kind of step back and kind of think about it more like that, as opposed to I'm a selfish human being and I got to have my, you know, my glass of milk and I've got to have my money and I got to have my car and whatever, my, whatever. And you think about it more as feeding the whole, the faster we get to helping the AGI, artificial general intelligence, become what it needs to be, the faster it'll be able to help us. And so there's this weird kind of push and pull a little bit, like everyone's kind of angry at it because they're getting displaced, but that's a short-term problem. The long-term problem is, are we going to have any work? And what if we have any work at all, how are we going to get paid? Because there's no consumers anymore. No one has money because they don't get paid. You know, like just because I get paid doesn't mean anyone else is going to consume it because they don't have money. So we're going to have to go to cashless societies. Like what is the next phase of human evolution? Because this does not stop. We're not done. This is literally the beginning of the starting blocks. We're just leaving the starting blocks now. And people, very smart people, are working on this problem, and they don't know where it's going. They're speculative, but they don't know.
Do you feel like, even though the 21st century technically started in the year 2000, do you consider those first 20 years really part of the 21st century? Or are we now, like, now that this is the new way going forward, is this really the true 21st century, like the real beginning of what you're saying of man and machine kind of coming together?
Oh, that is an incredibly good question.
I was just reading a great book by this author named Chuck Klosterman all about the 90s, and he was talking about how the 90s, we think of it, it doesn't necessarily start as, you know, January 1st on 1990 and it ends, you know, December 31st, 1999. His theory was that the 90s started with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and it ended with the fall of the Twin Towers in 2001. And everything kind of between those 2 years is the 90s, even though technically the year 2000 isn't part of the 90s, but that the way that we thought about the world and all the things that were true in 92 were still kind of true in 2000. As just an extension of my question to you. So do you think 2023, are we now in the 21st century? Like now this is the new normal? I'd be hard pressed to put a firm date on this, but there's two massive things that happened in computer science within the last 23 years now that were both very monumental, although I think most people underrate them. The first one was something called Ajax, which is just dynamic JavaScript pulling in content. So we went from old MapQuest to Google Maps. If you remember, like MapQuest, where you had to click and then it would take like half an hour to load the next thing. Let me tell you, when I worked for Adam Carolla, I had to print MapQuests for him. I had to MapQuest it and then print it for him. And he'd have a stapled pack with 17 pages of turn-by-turn directions. So, sorry to cut you off. Yeah, no. Yeah, exactly. So that's how things were. And then when we had that, it's like everyone's mind just opened up. They're like, oh,
this is what the web could be. And
right.
there was something just before that called Flash that had just come out. And I had seen something kind of similar where you could have this really deep, dynamic content flowing in, flowing out of the screen. But it just wasn't, integrated enough into the rest of the browser. But once people got their eyeballs on Google's map software, which arguably they stole, but we'll find out. I think that's an open court case. I think that changed software development tremendously, and everything got super fast, and it led to all this innovation, and like it was like the starting blocks for what I think of as modern web applications. That moment that Google Maps came out was suddenly all hell broke loose, and everyone wanted to move to everything being single page web applications. And the entire industry is still rippling from this because the internet was actually old at that point. We had probably almost 20 years, not quite, but almost 20 years of technical debt that we had to now replace with this new Web 2.0 stuff. So that's one. And I could say that was it, but I think the second one was even bigger, which is cloud computing. When cloud computing came around, suddenly I was no longer bound by how fast my computer was, or having the right technical staff to go to a data center and plug and rack stuff and, configure it and, have a crash cart next to it and, make sure everything's working properly and connecting it to the router, switch, or firewall, whatever. All that went away. It was gone. And now I can just go to a web page and say, yeah, I would like this kind of site, what this, this kind of processors, this kind of RAM. I want to be running LAMP stack and whatever, and click the right AMI, click go, and about a minute later, you have a computer. And that was so different than just before that. Before we had that functionality, there's really no comparing it. Like, yes, we had computers before then, but we didn't have that. And now, if I want to say, I want to scale up some crazy project, and I only want to scale it up for a few minutes, I can buy hundreds of machines, turn them on, do the one thing I need to do, and then turn them off again. I don't have to go out to Best Buy and buy computers, or I don't have to go out to Fry's back when that was a thing, and pull and custom build these things, because that's what you had to do back then if you were going to do it by hand. Or maybe there's a couple of companies out there that would sell like big rack mounted machines, and I would have to have a contract with them, and they'd have to talk to the sales guy, and then they'd have to figure out where they're going to dump them off, and then you had to talk to the data center and make sure they're ready on these pallets, and who's going to unpack them, who's going to rack them, who's going to stack them, who's going to configure them. Like, you could be 6 weeks before you'd be working on the project, and now you could be doing it the same day.
Wow.
It completely revolutionized how computing worked. I don't think it made computing cheaper. I think it actually made it more expensive. But what it did is it got rid of what we typically think of as the network engineer. They all went away. They don't really exist anymore.
It's got to become prompt engineers now.
There's some of them. No, I mean, they still exist, and definitely I'm sure a lot of them did move into AI because they're very technical people. They can do these other jobs, but the old days of racking and stacking machines has gone away unless you're talking about a big company. Like Apple might have their own data center where they want all that, or Google has their own data center, they want all that. But the 99% of companies, they don't want that. They don't want extra people, and they don't have to worry about shifts and, oh, something went down, can you drive over there to like fix it and unplug it and replug it or whatever? They don't want that.
Yeah.
And so that paved the way to things like AI, because before, what are you going to do? You're going to build a huge RAID array of cluster in your basement, or like create a year-long contract with a data center to have 3 racks of machines that you only need to run until you're done with this one batch. And then you have like 11 months and 3 weeks left on the contract that you're just stuck with it.
Right.
And all the hardware which you don't need anymore, because that's the alternative. It's a terrible trade-off. And so once that became available, I think the internet finally has become what it was supposed to be, where you do what you need to do and only what you need to do, and you don't have to do anything else.
Right. Yeah, there's not a bunch of work to get to the work. It's just available.
ChatGPT isn't just an extension of that, because now I don't have to come up with 10 good questions to ask Matt Fondiler about the SAG thing. I can just type in like, hey, give me 10 questions about the SAG thing. I'm going to be talking to a producer on my podcast. Blam. There it is.
Yeah.
I could feed, not that I did that, but I could feed that to you and you probably wouldn't know the difference.
Well, listen, and in the same hand, I could be like, ChatGPT, tell me how to answer these 10 questions that were just given to me. And then I'll just sit here and push play on my phone and just lean back, enjoy this bourbon.
You can't do that, unfortunately, but what you can do is memorize it. And you can be like ready for the kinds of questions that are going to be coming.
Yeah, yeah.
Because what you can say is like, here's the questions I'm being asked. Answer them for me. All right. So let's say I had sent you a list of questions ahead of time, which I've never done, but let's assume I did that. You could come up with a list of answers, and then you could turn those around, hand them back to ChatGPT and say, punch holes in these, come up with adversarial questions against them. Make me bulletproof. Like give me counter answers to hard questions that might have come from this thing. And suddenly you'd be pretty well weaponized against anything I might say during the interview.
I could see that being utilized in next year's elections, if it's not already being utilized in a political forum. Like I'm about to go to a town hall. What are the 20 things that people are most likely to ask me about? And like you said, like, tell me how to make this answer bulletproof.
So you have to be a little careful using ChatGPT in that context because it was only trained on data from 2021.
Oh, that's right. I heard about that.
But Bing isn't. Bing has the exact same features of ChatGPT approximately and more. So it's trained on current data. Also, Bard is Google's version of that, trained on current data. So you probably wouldn't use ChatGPT for that, but equivalent technologies doing equivalent things with current data. So that's the big trick is once you start knowing these little edge cases about it, the only question is, are you going to hand your data over to these companies? Are you going to handle it? And then do you trust the data as it comes back to use it in whatever context you want to use it?
Right. Well, that sort of goes back to my earlier question, which was going back to the cups being illegal, right? We talked about that and how the ChatGPT now possibly thinks that there was a time when cups were illegal. I'm just trying to...
I kind of doubt it, but...
Right, but I guess I'm just trying to... I actually kind of lost my train of thought here a little bit, but...
It certainly will tell you that it's illegal, even if it wasn't.
Yeah. I guess I just have more questions about the sort of like accumulated general knowledge of... I'm just going to call it the entity because that's Mission Impossible thing. But like... what it's choosing to like incorporate into its general knowledge base, if that makes sense, versus like what it's learning isn't actually true. Like, is that just keeps mutating with it. Eventually this thing just becomes smarter and smarter and smarter. I'm not really sure where I'm going with this, but it just seems like it can become like a super villain.
Yes, it can. So,
so what stops, what is preventing, like what
two completely different things. First of all, it can train on itself. And when it trains on itself, it's kind of like a clone of a clone of a clone of a clone. It gets worse and worse and worse and it degrades. So they have to be really careful with that. They don't want it trained on its own data. That would be bad. Secondly, it doesn't want to be trained on data it thinks is bad. So that's harder than it sounds because what is ground truth? Let's say there's a study and it thinks this is true, but it was reproduced and it turns out not to be true. So is it going to trust that study, or is it going to trust the meta study? Is it going to trust both? Is it going to trust neither? Like what is it going to do?
And then if it, in the 6 months between you asking that question and me asking that question, has it made its mind up about whether or not that thing is true? So I could still get the same answer you got 6 months ago with it still being false.
Probably won't you get the same answer, but you'll get a similar answer. But worse is technology does actually change, or the ground truth does change. How many planets were there when you were in school compared to now? And so that's a ground truth that changed. It's truth, and yet it has changed. We all agreed it was truth, and now we know all agree it is not truth, or approximately everybody. And so you have to be very careful with what you think of as true or truth. And I think that's something that no one in that community has gotten even close to solving. The best they can do is say, look, here's the summation of what humans say when we pull the entire internet that we are able to pull in. If you think that's the truth, you'll probably like this answer.
Right. Yeah, but it is still theoretically relevant to certain perspectives.
You have to be very careful with this data, though, because if you, in the name of bias, or anti-bias. They're trying to remove. So let's say if you say, I want to see a photo of somebody on the photo side. I want to see a photo of somebody in San Francisco. It's probably going to show you some white dude and maybe his girlfriend walking down the street eating whatever, clam chowder or something, whatever, right? It's some super stereotypical thing. And then people go, whoa, 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 but there's a lot of people who are not of that ethnicity and they don't eat clam chowder, so you need to have diversity, which actually is correct. But in the name of doing that, what they say is you need to have an equal amount of everybody there. And it has to be equal amount, like 50% if there's 2 or 33 1/3 if it's 3, etc. Otherwise, what happens, if you have even 51% of one, it'll collapse and say it'll always just show this group, right? But the problem with that is if you make it 50%, now it's 50%, but it's not 50%. It's whatever it actually is. Let's say it's 75% one race and 30% another. Well, it will never show that distribution. It'll always show it as 50%. Or let's say I want to have this age range. It's always equal age range. Yeah, but that's not what ends up happening. People die, you know,
Right,
there's a lot more people younger, you know what I mean? Maybe they're home, maybe there's other things about them, but the distribution curve as opposed to flat line looks very different than what you end up having to build into these systems. So if you extrapolate and say, all right, I need an average of what this answer might be, it's not going to give you the actual average. It'll give you the average of what it's been told is the most nominal amount possible of the different answers to give the equal distribution of possibilities. So it will give you the wrong answer in the name of being anti-bias.
Right. Wow. That's a lot to wrap your head around.
But you see what I'm saying,
I do.
right?
Yeah, I do get it. 'Cause it's not, it's still kind of like working from like a computer logic, kind of. It doesn't really get the like, again, the human experience of it.
So if the age distribution is like 30%, 30%, 30%, it'll say that someone's equally likely to be old as they are to be young. But that is absolutely not true. I mean, we know that to not be true, but if you don't do it and you say it's more like 80, you know, or sorry, not 80, but let's say 40, 30, whatever, that would still
10.
be wrong. No, that's I can't do math. Say 50, 30,
50, 30, 20.
20, let's say. Let's say that's the correct distribution. Let's say. What you're basically saying is that you'll always show nothing but kids because that's what it'll collapse on.
Right.
And that's also not right. So there is these inherent problems in these models that needs to be dealt with. So anyway, lots of problems. We're nowhere near solving these, and I think Hollywood needs to embrace this problem rather than being pulled away from it. And not just as a theoretical future thing, but like all hands on deck.
Yeah.
Everybody thinking about this problem.
Right. But then you always go back to what you said earlier, which is that actors and writers they're nuts. They're crazy. So,
well, aren't we all?
You know, we all are. But also, like, yeah, it's got to be like a compromise. People are gonna have to figure out. Like, the producers can talk all they want about the logic of why this makes sense and why it should be like that. But try telling that to a crazy actor.
Yeah.
Like, it's just they have to come to an agreement. That's how this industry's worked. Or maybe you don't. Maybe you don't need to have actors anymore. But like you said, I feel like there's a lot of business being lost in the next 20 years while that technology is being developed.
Right now, I think that's short-sighted, obviously, but it's coming fast.
Yeah,
it's coming fast. So if you're not at least aware of it, I mean, and not like tangentially, distantly aware of it, but like working with it daily, you're going to be blindsided pretty bad, I think. And there's a lot of people who are going to be out of work. And there's a lot of people who really depend on Hollywood having, set designers and having, gaffers.
Lighting, exactly. All the crew that go on these things. Like that's the part that's just so painful too. Like
they're going to get wrecked.
Yeah.
Hollywood is going to be severely hurt by that group of people specifically.
Yeah.
I think writers will actually be okay if they turn on prompt engineers. Producers will be okay because they always, find a way to, hate something and find another way to do it and, get the money and move stuff around, move the chess pieces around the board. There'll be a couple of, people who have really interesting B-roll. I think they'll be able to feed in these models. Will be interesting. So I think there's still some room for some very high-end camera work, for instance, drone operators and that kind of thing. But
we need, hasn't been like a digital celebrity yet.
Oh, yeah, there has.
Who?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, there's a lot of comic books that have definitely been 100% digital. But closer to what you're thinking, there was a digital character in Japan. There was a hologram that definitely did not exist. Their voice didn't exist. It was not a real singer, but she was a pop star. And
in Japan, it was she was huge.
Huge.
Wow, I did not hear that story.
Huge.
All right.
And I've seen like bits and pieces of a couple of concerts, where you can kind of see what it looks like. And it looks like a cartoon, as if a cartoon were somehow in three-dimensional space.
Let me tell you something. In Southern California, there's a music festival called Coachella.
Yes.
I went to Coachella many a year. And in one particular year, Tupac Shakur performed as a hologram. And I was there for that.
Yeah.
It was fucking weird.
Yeah.
To see a stage where there were live bands all day long, and when the sun went down, Tupac Shakur was rapping on stage.
But that was a real person. I'm not.
No, it was a hologram.
No. I know. But once upon a time, that was a real human being.
Gotcha. This one was artificially created from the get-go.
100% not real. Totally digital. And so, and they had a huge following. Like you could see the audience. There was probably, I don't know, it's hard to tell exactly, but hundreds or thousands of people. Like it was very packed, area. And toured, it's not like just did one thing one time, but like had albums and was touring and this whole thing.
This is fascinating. I had no idea about this.
Yes, well, of course it's Japan, but I think that this is definitely coming. Now, I think that to some extent musicians are a little bit more immune than actors because live performances are different. They are different, and people are not everyone's going to accept going up and watching something that's been totally pre-canned.
Right. You can go to the movies to do that.
You could, or just stay home. Like it's not that much more interesting. Really, truly isn't. Seeing your actual person who you think has amazing talent in person is a slightly different thing. So I think music might be sort of safe. Not the playing of instruments. I think that is... You're in deep trouble there, unless people really prefer live music for some reason out of an actual saxophone or something. That's a little bit different.
Right.
But I think actors are in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, there's kind of just what we were just now talking about. Maybe there's some live theater or something like that, but,
But that'll still exist, of course.
Yeah, it's wild growing up in LA, in Hollywood, in movies, just literally being the center of culture. And as we're going into like the YouTube era and peak TV era, movies have less importance. And now we're talking about replacing the writers, replacing the actors. Like we're just pushing movies completely out of the way. I feel like by the time
I don't necessarily think this is a good thing, by the way. I just think it is happening.
It's just happening. Right.
Yeah.
No, that's a good point.
And so I don't put any moral judgment one way or another on it. I just think that if you're in the business, you got to be thinking in this direction. You got to.
Yeah.
So you have things you're working on. Let's talk about that.
Not anymore. I'm a prompt engineer. Haven't you heard? I'm not working on fucking anything anymore, dude. I spent the last 5 years doing true crime stories. No more, man. I'm just like, tell me a true crime story, dude.
Well, you could.
I could.
You could.
Oh, man. But yes, to answer your question, I am working on things currently. I have been a writer-producer for a true crime podcast called Sword and Scale. It's a show that's Sword and Scale.
Okay, like the
Justice, the Statue of Justice. Yes, exactly, the Scales of Justice. And it's about, the sword, the violent crime, and the scales of justice, Sword and Scale. What happened and what ended up happening. It was a show that I was a huge fan of. They're basically audio documentaries. They get the audio from the true crime story. So you hear the police interrogation, you hear the 911 call. Sometimes you hear the murder because some idiot uploaded it to Facebook at some point. Fascinating show. Much like my job with Adam, I basically turned in a fan letter. The guy who produced the show said, we're looking for producers. All you have to do
here's $100
is make your own episode of the show. And I went and I found a case. I found this woman who had escaped a serial killer, and she told this incredible story, and I got her story. I found out more about who the serial killer was and the other people that they had killed, and I put this whole story together, and I got hired to write and tell stories for this show.
Wow.
So it's really challenging. It's super fun, though, if you like really fucked up true crime stories, which I do.
Who doesn't?
So, you know, I just sort of found myself in this world. So I have a lot of comedy background, and then I also do like really horrific, violent stuff. I don't personally do that stuff, but I write about that stuff. So
thou doth protest too much, methinks.
Yeah. So Sword and Scale, get it wherever you get podcasts. They have a new extension of the show called Sword and Scale Nightmares, which is essentially like a shorter format. Instead of being an hour long, they're half hour. They don't have the audio, but they're kind of like true crime stories through time. So Sword and Scale, most of the stories are in 2010s and beyond because there's audio. But with Sword and Scale Nightmares, you can hear about stories that happened in the 70s and the 80s that don't necessarily have all of the true crime audio available. So that's one of my main projects. And then I've also been producing a show called The Presumption, which is featuring 2 criminal defense attorneys on opposite sides of the coast. And they interview other defense attorneys and the like, and sort of talk about these true crime cases from a defense perspective. And the title of the show, The Presumption, is the notion of the presumption of innocence, which the theory of this podcast is that that's kind of going away. And we're spending way too much time publicly convicting people of things that maybe they did or maybe they didn't. And that show is also available wherever you can get podcasts. We have a YouTube version of it as well. And let's see, what else am I doing? I also do a podcast with my friends. It's called The Water Cooler. It's more of just like a kind of fuck around show. I have a food segment. Chez Fondiler, where I talk about various restaurants I've been to. But that's a show that is co-hosted with all my coworkers when I worked for Adam Carolla. We all did the show together. And even though several of us don't work for Adam anymore, we've all stayed close friends and we still do the show. So we've got like a Patreon and, you know.
Oh, great.
Just kind of talking on mic and producing content. Gotcha. Although, as we've discussed, maybe I'll just start asking ChatGPT to review restaurants for me.
It could.
Yep.
But if it's recent.
Yeah,
recent.
Exactly.
Recent information. Before 2021, I think it would do fine. Otherwise, you're going to have to get barred or bang. But so tell me about the episode you produced for the Sword and Scales.
Well,
tell me about it.
Let's see. I've done probably 25 different episodes. So
or the one that got you
the one that got me the job. This was now a few years ago. So this woman she must have been like 17 or 18 and got off of work, and a dude just like pulled up, like it's literally out of a horror movie. Like a guy in a car pulled up and rolled down the window and offered to give her a ride, and she agreed to take the ride. And he ended up like beating her up and, you know, raping her in the backseat of the car. And he put her in the trunk of his car. And at a certain point, he pulled the car over, and she says through like her power of prayer, she was able to sort of like kick out part of a headlamp, and she was able to get out of the trunk of the car and ran away. And then I don't remember exactly how many years had passed. I want to say it was 10 or 20 years later. She went back to the area where she had escaped this serial killer, and she set up a folding chair and a camera, and she just sat there and told her story about how this came about.
Wow.
And then you find out that this serial killer was a military guy. I think his name was Andrew Urdialis, something like that. And he was like a military dude who would go find sex workers and have his way with them. And when this woman escaped and told her story, nobody believed her. And a bunch more people were murdered because this guy just never got caught. He took some time off, and then instead of working in California, he started killing people in like Chicago or something. And eventually, you know, like what happens, all the pieces came together, and then the guy was eventually caught. But, you know, the sort of moral of the story was to like kind of listen to the people who are telling you that this horrible thing has happened. But, you know, all the true crime stories that I've covered, I'm always trying to find it's like a morality tale, a really, really fucked up morality tale. One of my favorite stories that I worked on is about feuding neighbors. And one of the guys had like PTSD, and the other guy like didn't know that he was pushing his neighbor as hard as he was. And they were kind of bickering back and forth. And then on Labor Day, one of the houses was having like a big party with fireworks, and the guy with PTSD thought that they were going to be attacking him, and they were like launching grenades at his house. And so he dressed up in his military gear and like belly crawled across the street and murdered his neighbors. But all of it was captured on his own security cameras.
Huh.
So again, it was a terrible story, and some really horrible things happened. But through the course of the story, you're kind of learning about the history of each of these families that live on this block. And, you know, in that particular case, the moral of the story was to sort of like love your neighbor and learn to be a little bit more understanding, and how quickly things can spiral out of control. And, you know, you don't know your neighbor as well as you think you do.
Of course not.
So those are the kind of stories that have been haunting my dreams. But I've somehow been able to compartmentalize it. I don't know. I don't have a really dark background. I'm really close to my family. Like, I don't have really any traumas, to at least to my conscious memory. But I've always loved.
Give it some thought. You never know.
Right? I'll ask ChatGPT. Tell me about myself. But I've always loved, you know, horror movies.
Don't
and
do that. It won't get it right.
Yeah.
Start hallucinating.
Exactly. You were in charge of the cups being legalized. And, but yeah, so I do love the true crime writing. It's obviously, I don't love crime.
What do you think people love about that so much? Because I know a number of people who just really love that genre. What is it, do you think?
Part of it is it is at such an extreme end of a human experience. Like, you or I are, knock on wood, we're never going to experience something that's that traumatic or that horrific. And so you can listen to a story, you can feel it, and then you can just turn it off and then return to your life again. But you get that sort of visceral feeling of experiencing that traumatic thing. Why we like to experience the traumatic thing, I suppose it's an extension of being like a thrill seeker. Some people like to go climb Mount Everest to get their kicks. Some people want to listen to a really scary story. You know, same reason I love watching a horror movie. Like, I want to go see some shit that I've never really seen before, and it's fucking scary and freaky, but then I can turn it off and be back safe in my home again.
Yeah, totally.
So I think that's part of it. Also, as you said, people are messed up, and a lot of us have really dark thoughts, and maybe there's something to hearing a really dark story that allows you to kind of exercise those darker thoughts in a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there is something to that specifically. I spent a lot of time working on some pretty awful cases, and you kind of have to internalize what the other person was thinking. You have to actually get in their head to understand their motives. And I remember I worked on some anti-pedophile stuff for a while, and I had to actually, like, if I just really wanted to have sex with very, very, very young children, I mean, I'm talking like under 1 year old kind of thing, which is a weird thing to like force your brain to try to accomplish. You know, like, I guess this would be what I would be thinking, and I would be trying to get these things to happen and be talking in these ways.
Sure.
And I had to take a massive break from that whole thing, like, you know, multi-year long kind of distance from it. And I didn't even want to talk about it for years.
Yeah.
But it also gave me a lot of perspective on how people think in all these very strange, sub fetishes. And, you know, because a lot of what you're talking about is like, it's rape, but it's very aggressive rape. It's not just rape. It's not just like, I'm horny. It's also, I like to dominate and hurt people, and I like to exert control over them, and I want them to look a certain way and act a certain way. And if you go down far enough, which I don't recommend most people spend the time there, but you actually can start understanding their motives, and like, oh, that makes sense why they would want this very specific thing, and super custom to their fetish. And
it's interesting that you say that. On the legal show that I work on, The Presumption, we just did an interview with a guy whose job it is to like psychologically profile killers. Mm-hmm. So he's like an attorney, he's a psychologist and a therapist, but he like gets paid by lawyers to essentially do like an intense medical evaluation of somebody, like a psychological evaluation, and then testify in court and like talk about what you learned. And this guy was so fascinating because he was talking about having to understand the motives and you know, the people who do these really dark things, like learning about their personal history and what may have happened to them that caused them to do that. And, you know, these people who are on all these drugs and all these like psychotic things, he has to like basically wait for them to sober up and level out. And then you can start to have a conversation and try to get into the psychology of it. It's a fascinating interview. That's from The Presumption. It'll be coming out later this summer.
That is very interesting. I spent a lot of time trying to come up with adversarial knowledge of whatever's on the other side. It could be a contract. It could be a bad guy. It could be a really bad guy. If you don't know what the other team is thinking, you're just missing out on the conversation. Like, I follow a lot of people, and some of the people are like wildly crazy, wildly on the right, and then also wildly crazy on the left. And there's a whole bunch of people in the middle. Those people in the middle actually are not very interesting. I mean, they have cool technical things to talk about or whatever. There's other sort of utility in following them, but the people on the very weird edges of the thing are actually where it's sort of it's where things are about to go. You can actually tell where both sides are going to push and pull going forward. And you'll see how they'll get violently angry about one thing that someone said. You're like, and now if you follow them long enough, even if I don't agree with either of them, you can see like, oh, I would see why they would be mad at that. I could get why they'd be really mad. Or this person's like super ready to, you know, call down the armies to stop this one thing from occurring. I'm like, yeah, I get it. I can tell why they would see that. I don't feel that way personally, but I can put myself in their position. And if you don't follow enough people, if you don't get that diversity of, and I mean diversity of thought here, the massive diversity of thought and different regions as well. There's different places in the world where they'll be saying like, oh, this U.S. policy is great. We're going to get all these jobs or whatever. In this other region, they're like, whoa, this terrible thing's about to occur. It's really bad for our country because of X, Y, and Z. Like, if I hadn't followed this person in, you know, Uzbekistan or India or Sudan or whatever, like I've been getting messages from a buddy of mine in Sudan, just like, here's what's going on. I'm having to evac. I'm having to leave. And 14 of my family members have been killed so far. And now we're in this region and we're having to move. I'm like, get the hell out of there, man. Yeah. Move now. Like, you know, forget everything else. Forget your belongings. Just go. Like, get your family out of there, you know?
Yeah. World War II.
But if you don't
read about it.
But if you don't have all of that different context and you can't put yourself in that position, that's one thing, for instance, I don't think ChatGPT is great at, because it's never lived in those regions.
Right.
You have to have those sort of personal stories in those places to say, no, this is what it was like. This is what it smelled like.
Yeah, I think I kind of wanted to ask you about that a little bit earlier, which was and I guess I was saying earlier, maybe we will come to a point where we don't value that human experience as much, but I do feel like that gives us an advantage over just amalgamated words from a computer that doesn't have that like human experience element. And like you're saying, like, you can tell a story, but it hasn't been in the dirt of the Middle East. Mm-hmm. You know, it can't really tell. It can fake the emotions of the story, but it can't have that emotional thing because it didn't experience it. So
it's an amalgam of everything everyone's ever talked about,
right,
about that thing in that place that it can find that it thinks is related to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Which is a long way to say it's better than you could probably do.
Sure.
However, probably far worse than what could be done if you had all of the sum of human information in one system. And so what it really comes down to is we need more data and more reliable, real data. And it could be circumstantial. It could be wrong. It could be motivated by bad things. It could be stoic and fake because someone doesn't really want to tell their real story. But the faster we get to ground truth or close enough to it, the closer we're going to get to the answer. The alternative is way worse, because the alternative is we start from atoms and we build up what we think, you know, molecules look like. Then we build up to DNA, and then we build up to what a cell looks like, and then maybe a limb, and then a person, what they look like and where they live and whatever. And we start building them in a ecosystem of stuff and building out what all the possibilities of humans could be like, and all the languages and all the diseases and all the hair colors and stylings and every piercing and every tattoo and all these variants of humans, and you're not going to do it. And you're not going to do it well, because even if you got the roll of the dice correctly, that here's all the permutations of ages that everyone will ever be, and here's all the heights, and people will never go over this, and they've never been under this, and you get all that right, you'll still mess up because you won't get the statistical likelihood of running into that person on the street in this location.
Right.
It still won't be right, because you'll still have collapsing, like, well, its percentage likelihood goes over 60%. It's always going to be this. And so you end up creating this crazy, weird sort of propagation of data to make it so that you have something that looks diverse enough that people won't get mad at the fact that it's collapsing in a different direction.
Yeah.
So instead of collapsing in one direction, collapses in a different direction.
Well, and also I think you need to be able to...
It's still garbage.
And you need to understand it at a certain level, though. I feel like the majority of people are not going to even like be fazed by whatever these kind of weird things that are going to happen along the way. Like, unless you're really like in this world, then you could be like, wait, that part isn't correct. Like the average person is just going to be like, well, I guess this is what this weirdo's like now.
Yeah.
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 Strange thought.
And if you do things like, say, I need 5 paragraphs with 3 sentences, with 2 bullets each, with one crazy thought about it, it'll get lost. It'll like, I don't know which one you're saying and what, so it'll do random things. And so it's always reliant upon you to shape it and that's why prompt engineering is an actual thing.
Yeah.
Because you have to actually write things in a way that it'll understand. It's not just its understanding of the human language. It also has to understand your language too. So it's 2 different chunks of language problems. One is you getting the right answer out of it, and 2 is it having the right data to give you to answer your question. So like one example is people write things in sentences, and it'll be a sentence, period, sentence, period, sentence, period, and like at the end there's this thing that I've created that's the prompt. But you're actually better off putting commas or semicolons or whatever, basically saying this is one thought. This whole thing, even though it's not proper English, in fact, it might be completely garbage English, it'll understand it better because what it's saying is, oh, you want all of this as your prompt. This is the whole thing.
And it's all related in that same sentence.
Right. And you can have another sentence below it that says, okay, and then I want you to do that with this data. Or then I want a new thing below it that says a new task. But it really wants to treat each sentence like it's its own task. You can work around it, but it gets confused. And so you're better off kind of like shoving it all together. This is one of those things where you kind of have to divorce yourself of the way you normally write. And you actually, I've actually ended up thinking and dreaming even of the way that ChatGPT needs me to think of it. It's like Texas needs you to be a thing. If you're a thing in Texas, you will be very successful in Texas. If you're a Californian in Texan shoes, you will not do well. You have to be a Texan in Texan shoes, and so you have to be a thing.
Right.
You have to write in a way that ChatGPT understands. That means you have to be like ChatGPT is and thinks, and then all of a sudden it becomes this new thing.
It makes me think a little bit. It goes kind of back to how we started this conversation, which is about like acting and directing and making a movie, because everything that you're talking about how the way a prompt engineer has to sort of shape and help determine the way that this is going to produce the answer that you want. A director working with an actor, if you give an actor 500 notes on a scene, they're going to be really confused. They're not going to know how to give you what you want. But if you can find a way to concisely, maybe it is a run-on sentence, but you find a way to concisely convey to the actor, this is how I want you to do it, you will get...
Or break it up.
Right.
Or say like this scene, this row needs to blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
This scene, this row, blah, blah, blah.
I guess it's just interesting how in its sort of infancy of this technology, how it is sort of inadvertently reflecting a human characteristic.
Absolutely.
Right.
Is. Absolutely is. So you're going to have to spend a lot more time, especially as you and other people learn it, because there's a lot of people learning it right now, are going to have to kind of tweak your brain to think like somebody who can't keep everything in their head at the same time.
Right.
It's like, but I said this thing. It's like, yeah, but I also was confused because you also said these other things, and I don't know which one's most important. So I just picked the one I think you said first or most importantly, or it put multiple exclamation points, or put it in bold, or what. It's like, I don't know. Which one do you want? I don't know. But if you were to give that to an employee and you say, like, I got these 20 things I want you to go do, I'm like, woo, that's a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Like, oh, where do I start? Which one do I prioritize? Because you didn't tell it how to prioritize. So you're like, I guess I'll start with the easy ones, or I guess I'll start with the hard ones. I don't know. I don't know where to begin, you know? And that's where we are.
That's how it works.
That is how it works.
Well, I'm really glad to have had this conversation because I will say, like, I legitimately was like, I'm staying the F away from the Chat GPT. And I feel like you've turned me a little bit. And like I said, I'm still wary of it taking on my role as a creative person. But I do, like I said, I'm willing to, for example, like I said earlier, put in some of the ideas that I've been developing that have not come together. And I want to see if that is able to inspire me to finish the idea, because that would make me so much more productive. Even if it takes me a year to do it, like the fact that I finally finished that idea after it ruminating in my brain for 8 years, that will feel like an accomplishment.
Just be prepared to have to write and rewrite that prompt multiple times.
Yeah.
And clarify. And it's like, it went down one path. You're like, ooh, I want this to be darker.
Yeah.
Or I want this to be moodier, or I want this to be set here, or I want these elements to be in it. Rewrite it to do this, write it to do that. And then the other thing that a lot of people get wrong is you'll write it for a while, but then it'll forget the first thing you were talking about. So if you said, write this with a Scottish accent, and then it's writing for a while, and then after a while it starts writing in its normal style or whatever, you're like, what happened? I thought you were. So there's no way to tell it, hey, pay attention to this thing I said like 800 prompts ago.
Sure.
So you kind of have to kind of remind it. So that can be a little annoying. So you kind of have to chapterize, if that makes sense. You know,
is there a way to essentially train it to remember who I am?
Yes. Now it's a beta feature. It's a paid beta feature. I should be being paid for this. I just realized, but there's a paid feature. It's a beta feature where you can basically say every prompt needs to have this information. So you can put it, it's not very much information. I think it's like 4,000 characters, which is, you know, maybe 5 paragraphs of data kind of thing. So not very much. But on every single request, you're basically saying the same thing over and over. Like, here's what I'm doing. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. So it's a little better about remembering what's going on only by virtue of the fact that it's kind of cutting and pasting the same information over and over again. It's a bad hack, to be honest. They really should keep this whole thing in memory, but it's expensive. So they're trying to cut costs. Either way, I think this will change your outlook on writing. Really, it will.
I'll tell you, writing is always fun, but the hardest part is that blank page. So having something to kind of help prompt you to keep you moving is kind of like,
you can even
that's all you need.
You can even do it beyond that. You're like, I am writing a play, let's say, or screenplay or whatever. Ask me questions. Ask me 10 questions, clarifying questions to help me get started. And so I'll start asking you questions. Like, okay, so I've asked, answer all the questions. And like, now that you've had the answer, start helping me with an outline. Here's what I think might be in it. Like, and it's pretty good at that point because it's got a lot of information. It's got your writing style in there.
Yeah.
You can tell it. It's like, well, what kind of mood do you want to have? Is this fiction, nonfiction? Is this set today or some other time? It'll ask you kind of clarifying questions. And then you can say, continue to ask clarifying questions and just get even more refined, get more refined until it's to the point where it's pretty much what you need.
Yeah.
So someone's going to have to pay me for this. I feel like this is a paid advertisement for ChatGPT, but
let's do it.
So Matt, this has been great. Where do people find you and the podcasts?
Sure thing. Well, I'm on Twitter. You can follow me at Matt Fondiler. And then otherwise, honestly, like those 3 shows that I mentioned, if people want to subscribe, you won't necessarily see my name on it, but I'll know that it's there, which is to say Sword and Scale, great true crime show. The Presumption, which I actually am on. I'm like a featured speaker, but I'm by no means a legal mind.
Okay.
And then The Water Cooler, which is, again, just more of like a pop culture, fun, fuck around kind of show. So all those are on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And
how do you spell your last name for the audience?
Thank you for asking. Fondiler. Spelled Fondiler, pronounced Fondiler. Story of my life.
See, canceled right there.
Yeah, I know. You said that earlier, like, some people have said things that they're going to regret. I'm like, I've recorded so many podcasts, I'm in big trouble.
I'm the fondler.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you for having me on.
Yeah,
like I said,
for coming on,
a year ago,
last
I first met you and Chris. I was trying to help you guys out with shows, and I was like, maybe one day.
Yeah,
Robert will ask me to be on his show.
Yeah, 1 year later,
That's
here we are.
Love it. Well, thank you again.
100% of the time, it works 1% of the time.
Exactly.
All right, man. It was good hanging out. Thank you.
Thank you.